surely the newsroom would then look to protect its own journalists over basically just caving immediately to this external pressure now.
You would think so. You would think that there would be any rules in place or policies in place to protect journalists, but I haven't seen that.
Laura, thank you so much for joining us today. In its simplest terms, what you've been investigating has been the ways in which pro-Israel biases are born within US newsrooms. Can you tell us a bit about the investigation and basically what was investigated and why?
Thank you so much for having me. It's really great to be talking to you guys. Again, I love the work that you guys are doing. So I embarked on an investigation looking at how U.S. newsrooms repress journalists who are trying to push for fair and accurate reporting on the genocide in Gaza. It took almost a year to basically come about. And I was approached by Prism Reports, which is a movement media organization based in the United States that are doing really good work on the US and in the US. And they're part of the Movement Media Alliance, which I encourage a lot of people to check out. It's a lot of progressive news organizations that actually cover Palestine properly. But the idea was, we're not trying to uncover whether there is bias in U.S. newsrooms. We know there is. And we're not looking at the superficial notions of what bias looks like. Oh, omission, propaganda, headlines, not using Palestinian sources, parroting Israel. We know this, but what are the mechanisms behind them? Are there people trying to push back? Is this just moot? Is there anything that we can actually do? And I ended up, and I think I'm very lucky that I ended up speaking to a majority of journalists of Arab, Middle Eastern, Muslim, or Swana descent, which I think gave a very unique outlook on how bias actually looks like in U.S. newsrooms. And what we came up with is bias exists. It exists in forms that actually oppress journalists, silence voices, muzzle the truth, fabricate it, all out in the open, all with complete pride. And it's not a mechanism that just exists as editorial policy, but there are a lot of external pressures, which we can talk about in a little bit, a lot of external pressures that actually drive the direction of what can actually be printed or said on air about Palestine.
Yeah, so one of the recurring themes in this investigation was, as you said, the systemic existence of prejudices. Can you begin to explain what some of these patterns and attitudes and what, I guess, the practices, the specifics behind all of this? How did this look?
Yeah, so I spoke to nearly a dozen journalists in a very spectrum of media in the U.S. We're talking international media based in the U.S. to progressive media to centrist media to public media, national media, whatever you can think of. And what's interesting is all these journalists had quite similar experiences in the newsroom when it came to covering the genocide. It looked like repeated rejections of their pitches, some claiming that, we don't cover international news, when that isn't true, right? They've covered Ukraine, they've covered Iran, the women movement, they've covered Afghanistan. It's just when it comes to Palestine, all of a sudden, it's not our beat. We're not going to delve into this. We don't have the expertise. There was a lot of double standard in coverage, but also a lot of double standard in who gets to tell the story. If they do end up deciding to cover the genocide in Gaza, it is most likely a white male or Israeli reporter who takes the lead, either on screen or leading, or on basically the front line of the reporting in the bylines. And a lot of the reasoning comes when talking to Palestinian or any other journalist who has been working on the Middle East for a long time. One journalist told me that her objectivity was questioned in front of her colleagues because she's had family members killed in Gaza. So, she's too moody. Can she actually lead coverage when she's been on screen for over 7 years covering the Middle East? All of a sudden, a white male reporter who's never covered the Middle East is a better suited I guess, truth teller than she is. There have been other instances where, there's a repeated reliance on Israeli sources, a repetition, a parroting of Israeli propaganda going unchallenged, just quoting Israeli military spokespersons. And if someone says, well, actually, can we fact check this? Can we, get somebody else to look at it or say something to counter it? No, that's the fact. And then you have a lot of debates on terminology usage, right? And this isn't new. I mean, we've had a bunch of leaked memos from the New York Times and other organizations where they literally tell their journalists, don't use this word, avoid using this word. I even remember sometime after the Unity Intifada in 2021, I think it was maybe in 2022, there was a tweet that went viral and got deleted by somebody from the Washington Post saying that, they have an automatic system that changes the word Palestine to Palestinian territory, or that changes other terminology. So the list goes on and on and on. But it's important to know that there's a system in place when it comes to covering Palestine and when it comes to covering the genocide in Gaza. And anybody who's trying to get out of, I guess, the line of the Israeli narrative is considered uncredible, and is often sidelined. All of a sudden, you are no longer being sought for photography or for articles or for pitches, to the extent that there was one journalist who told me, she pitched a story about an Islamic art exhibition. It had nothing to do with Palestine, but was told she cannot do it because it will be assumed that it was related to Palestine. Number one, because it's about Islamic art. Number two, because of her name sounded ethnic, even though she's not even Palestinian. So it's a lot of wild.
Does that then extend to, for example, because we know that, for around a year, Lebanon was also very involved with the genocide in Gaza. Did it also extend to Lebanon, to Yemen, obviously to Iran in the short bouts that they had traded rockets with Israel? Was it also?
Yes, any story related to Israel, any attempt to, let's say, name Israel as an aggressor was always sort of pushed back against. Now, I only looked on coverage on Gaza, so I can't speak about the others. But looking in general, actually looking at the articles that have come out, I mean, come on, when Israel did the walkie-talkie a terrorist attack, honestly, in Lebanon, a lot of the headlines, a lot of the coverage was like, wow, what a technology, what technology they have, so fantastic. And you had kids died, people were grocery shopping, and they're, how insane it is for journalists to sort of praise a technological advancement of a terrorist state. It's quite insane.
Yeah, I mean, it was, you saw it in the images afterwards. I mean, there are still loads of pictures of children who have just lost their sight completely. Everybody who was in the vicinity of the pages that exploded. But I guess my question now is really how pervasive all of this was. You said it was widespread, but did it maybe change depending on maybe if it was a more left-leaning, because we've seen how Palestine has become maybe somewhat coined as a left-wing issue in the Western world. Was it slightly favorable, the coverage in a left-leaning newsroom? I was
actually, one of the most surprising things out of this investigation is that some of the progressive newsrooms that we happened to look at did not want to cover Palestine. I mean, the one that is named in my article is More Perfect Union, which, I mean, come on, why wouldn't they cover Palestine? It made absolutely no sense. The individual I spoke with said that across the newsroom, there was maybe 8 to 9 journalists or media workers at the newsroom who wanted to cover Palestine. It was in the news. They could cover it from a trade perspective. They could cover it from a workers' rights perspective. Even, they told me that their own audience would send them DMs on social media and say, hey, why aren't you talking about this? Why aren't you talking about this? And the recurrent response was, this is not our expertise. We're not interested in covering, labor for ceasefire. That's not something we're interested in. And later on, you realize that, the head of More Perfect Union wanted to be DNC chair, right? So he was so enmeshed in the Democratic Party. They had basically interests with the Democratic Party. They wanted to show Biden in good light. Any criticism Biden was essentially a criticism of how America handled the genocide in Gaza. So I was actually surprised that one progressive outlet did not want to cover Palestine. And what was interesting is after, they never responded to any request for comment, but right after the article went out, they actually published, I guess, their only report about Gaza, which was, the Italian worker strike for Palestine. I don't know if that's because it went so viral or if they actually had some pressure, because when you have an American union coming out and calling for a ceasefire, that's newsworthy. They wouldn't even report that, and I thought that was so strange. But then you had, I mentioned international newsrooms that are really good on the Middle East, but sidelined their Palestinian reporters, which was also surprising to me. Did you ask them,
did you get in touch with them, asking them why they were sidelining?
So that's the thing, that I had a hard time getting a response from outlets on a lot of things that were said, but I did speak to a number of journalists who attested to that. I also, I did get a response from the New York Times, which is, considered a liberal mainstream media organization in the US. That was an interesting response, actually, because at the time, we can talk about it. At the time, the Writers Against the Genocide in Gaza they've had multiple campaigns thus far, but they put out a dossier that showed that about 21 reporters or media workers at the New York Times had actually ties to the Israeli military or interests with the Israeli state. And that's blatant bias right in your face. Like, how can you have somebody lead coverage on Palestine who is so enmeshed with the Israeli regime, the Zionist regime as a whole? And their response was that it was vile accusations, that these are public information and it's just personal attacks on their journalists. And they came up with the defense that actually they've contracted Palestinian journalists in Gaza who've won them awards. And that's something, one of the individuals I spoke with, Sana Saeed, she emphasized it as well, is that a lot of these newsrooms, they use us as Palestinian journalists, as journalists of color, as an excuse to say, hey, actually, we paid this person to get some photos for us. We paid them look, they want us an award. We're doing good reporting. That good reporting is often exploitative. They drop the journalists as soon as anybody accuses them of anti-Semitism. Number one. It is also not only is it exploitative, it's also filled with omissions, right? We talk about the humanitarian suffering of the Palestinians, not who caused it. And I think that's really problematic.
So then what role do Palestinians play in all of this? Because if they can just because ultimately the ones in Gaza have been suffering under genocide for 2.5 years now, whilst all of these people at the top, the people with money, are kind of playing around with them almost, it seems. What role do they have to play?
Honestly, the only role Palestinians, journalists in Gaza have to play and have played is getting their voice out there, no matter the way. I think that's something that we need to champion, no matter what. But I think it lies on us in the diaspora, the journalists in the diaspora, the associations in the diaspora, the analysts, the speakers in the diaspora, to put pressure on organizations who are sort of exploiting our name to advance their propaganda, to say that, to manufacture consent for genocide while saying, oh, but we paid this journalist to get us this clip. So it's on us, and it started, a lot of people are boycotting the New York Times, unsubscribing from it. They're refusing to comment when journalists reach out to them, to get comments for whatever story that exists. I think there needs to be much more pressure. We're seeing more and more journalists from the BBC, from the CNN, just quit their jobs, say, you know what, there's a lot of bias here. I am not seen. The Palestinians are not seen. I'm no longer going to be part of this. There's a really good article called House of Arab about a fact checker who was at the New Yorker. I think people should read that.
Yeah. So, if we now just look at how this all works, basically, you spoke, I think you touched on a bit at the beginning about how there's different types of pressures that exist within the newsrooms. Can we start on the internal pressures? What does this kind of look like?
We can say there's about 5 to 7 reasons, and I can go through them. Number one, ownership of an outlet. If you actually look at the top head, the individuals who own these the media corporations, they're either openly Zionist, just out there, they're married to the ideology of Zionism, and thus that drives the editorial policy of their organization, or their board of directors have actual financial and business interests with the Israeli state, whether it's that they're investing in certain institutions or have partnerships with the Israeli regime, so they have interests that they cannot falter. The other thing you have is affiliation. Part of that is that bylines are led by former Israeli soldiers or spouses or mothers of Israeli soldiers or intelligence officers who are, coming into the journalism world and all of a sudden fabricating all this news, but we're trusting them because they were inside the regime, right? We see this with the editor-in-chief of The Atlantic who dropped out of school to volunteer as an Israeli guard. We see it with that reporter who reported about, the fabricated rape story, Screams Without Words in the New York Times. She's not even a journalist. Right? She was part of the Israeli intelligence community. And there are more and more and more and more examples, including, for example, the executive editor of the New York Times, who, and this gets me to my next point, whose father is on the board of Camera. And Camera and Honest Reporting, for example, they're sort of media lobby groups that claim to be quote unquote watchdogs on the media, on its coverage on the Middle East, but the only thing they do is harass, threaten to sue, and just completely occupy a U.S. newsroom with their repeated demands for quote unquote corrections of when they don't like that a Palestinian guest was featured, when they don't like how the occupation was described, when they don't like that we talked about Israel bombing children, that they need to correct that because Israel, there needs to be a reason for that. Hamas was there. There needs to be a reason for why Israel's committing all these violations. And that's sort of one of the other reasons. Media lobby groups are extremely powerful, extremely influential. Why? Because there's nobody on the other side pushing back. So as a journalist, there's this saying, which I absolutely hate, but it's the idea that if you're being bugged by both sides of a story, you're doing your job. But when you only have Camera and Honest Reporting harassing journalists in newsrooms, and you don't have anybody on the other side saying, hey, thank you for reporting this, or you've reported this inaccurately, here's a better source, then they're repeatedly conceding their power to these lobby groups. And it goes beyond just threats and legalese. They actually go after journalists themselves. They accuse them of anti-Semitism, ask their organizations to fire them, to lose their jobs. You also have advertising. One journalist I spoke to for my piece told me that one of the sponsors of the media outlet that they worked for actually pulled their sponsorship, and they said why. They said, because you recently did anti-Israel coverage, so I'm no longer going to sponsor you. It's just so blatant and out there. And I guess the last thing I'll say here is, which we don't really want to give credit to, but there's ignorance in U.S. newsrooms. We're really giving so much credit to these journalists who, maybe went to journalism school, maybe didn't, but don't really know much about the Middle East, don't really understand the history of Palestine. They don't really understand the occupation. So most of them may be local newsrooms who rely on the New York Times or CNN for their narratives. They just don't know that it's wrong. These are, I guess, the multiple causes. Yeah.
But then because you touched on these lobby groups that exist, surely the newsroom would then look to protect its own journalists over basically just caving immediately to this external pressure now.
You would think so. You would think that there would be any rules in place or policies in place to protect journalists, but I haven't seen that as someone, let's say, outside of that, and the people that I spoke to. I remember one journalist who wasn't featured. He told me that, they tried to organize themselves, right? They had an employee resource group. They thought their outlet wasn't doing a good job. They thought there was a lot of external pressure, and they came to the head of the organization and said, hey, we have these grievances. We can give you proper sources. We can help out, et cetera. And they were basically told, an employee resource group is not an official part of an organization. It's something you guys do with each other. If you have a grievance, you need to individually raise it. And that creates sort of a state of intimidation, I guess, that it becomes up to the individual reporter, unprotected by the group, to go and say something.
That was going to be my next question, whether there's a culture of fear really in the media. I guess if it's down to the individual, it really kind of...
I think it's going to depend on what newsroom you're looking at, right? If there's a minority journalists of color, you're more often scrutinized, right? I mean, I've heard a lot of stories, and some of the people I spoke to also told me this, is that when the genocide began, almost immediately, a lot of the heads of these media organizations put out statements, internal statements for their employees to say, like, hey, like, we see you if you need assistance, like, we're against anti-Semitism. All of it is obviously directed to their Jewish reporters. And so when other journalists said, hey, like, we actually have Palestinians and Lebanese and Iranians on staff that are also impacted, who also have family that have been impacted, are you going to issue a similar statement? And it's either no response or, oh, well, if they need help, let them approach. I know one of the journalists I spoke to, she said that they really tried to lobby their organization to put out a statement like, how can you not talk about the protection of journalists? How can you not talk about it? And the only thing they would come up with, they wouldn't even put out an editorial about journalists in Gaza. They put out a general editorial about protection of journalists everywhere. And then one of the countries mentioned, countries, Gaza, I can't even say Palestine, is Gaza. So like it's a huge issue. Like, I think with big organizations, one of the first people I talked to, Nadia, but if you're reading the article, it's on Prism, you guys can check that out. She talks about how she was singled out every time she wanted to pitch anything. When any of her stories went viral, she would be taken aside and basically like attacked by a group of editors, just sitting down and questioning her journalism, where to the extent she felt so small, surveyed, that she couldn't do it anymore. She felt like she was the only voice in the newsroom trying to cover Palestine, trying to cover Israeli aggression in the region. Nobody else was pushing for that. She was that only voice, and that only voice was being muzzled. How can we protect these journalists? I think the question isn't about how organizations can protect them, because clearly they won't. Or these organizations, these outlets need to be held accountable themselves. So how can we, as the public, as journalism associations, as human rights organizations, we talk about protection of journalists all around the world, but what kind of action can we take to actually stop Israel from killing journalists, to stop media organizations from muzzling, silencing journalists who are trying to actually report the truth in the US?
I mean, that kind of leads me nicely onto from what you said, because I was thinking, how can we hold them accountable? And I think something that's been pretty apparent in the last couple of years is how trust in traditional media outlets has just plummeted. People are now listening to alternative media like Let's Talk Palestine, subtle plug. And there's little trust in mainstream media. Is this not enough of a reason for the people at the top to think maybe we should change course and actually protect and establish some kind of guidelines to ensure that there is relatively fair reporting?
Listen, I hope so. I'd hope so. But I think that media organizations don't really realize the power of the news consumer. I think they're putting a lot of weight on their advertisers and the lobby groups and the ownership, because that's, for now, where I guess the money is for them, where the attention is. I mean, at the end of the day, a lot of these organizations are behind a paywall. You still have to, there are people who are subscribing to read, they're interested. The media sphere is changing though, and I don't know if that's going to eventually impact these organizations. I do know that at least for one individual I spoke to, they were brought on because there was a lot of criticism within the newsroom that, hey, we don't have an alternative voice. So, there might be attempts internally to try to bring on these different voices, but they still have to work within a particular system. journalism. The other thing is, with the media sphere changing, I think news consumers are becoming more and more media literate. They're becoming more and more media aware. They're actually questioning. I think, how many times are you gonna be told a hospital was bombed because of Hamas before, and you see all these images, and are you really gonna believe it? No matter what political spectrum you're on, no matter whether you know a lot about the region or you don't, when you see images of dismembered children and women who are forced to give birth over the rubble, and men who keep being taken away from their families, strip searched, and even at Ziteman, the use of sexual violence against them, an average news consumer is not going to believe the lie that Israel is defending itself. Israel is doing this because Hamas is hiding in a hospital, so we had to kidnap everybody there and kill everybody there. I think that people are changing. People are changing the way that they consume news. And with that, you're seeing a huge, I guess, move to independent media, like Let's Talk Palestine, like Prism, like Dropsite News, like ZAO, like all these different organizations, all these different individuals, including creator journalists who are just on their social media, just telling you the news. That's where we're getting it from. There is one thing I do want to touch on, like talking about trust in the news. The fabricated stories that have come out. Yeah, I don't know if you want to.
I was about to ask you about it, because I think one of the clearest examples of this, and I think you mentioned it before with the New York Times, was the October 7th rape scandal, mass rape that Hamas inflicted upon the Israeli women in the surrounding villages. Yeah. What happened to that story in the end?
Yeah. So I'm going to tell you 3 stories that have, they're just inaccurate in their reporting, and nothing happened out of it. So the first one is what you just talked about, screams without words. Again, quote unquote reporter who is not actually a journalist, who has ties to the Israeli intelligence community. She was a former intelligence officer with the Israeli Air Force, and she basically tried to push the trope that Hamas had raped this girl. And when you look at the reports that came after of how she actually approached the family to get their testimonies, the family tell you that they were misled, that they thought this was an obituary for the member of their family. And I guess I remember one family member came out and said, like, she wasn't raped. I don't know what they're talking about. There was also no evidence. The reporter couldn't find evidence from clinics or police reports for any rape cases, but the New York Times still went through with it as if there are several rape cases. To this day, a lot of international organizations are unable to verify such testimonies. On top of that, internally in the New York Times, they have a podcast that was supposed to repackage the story as a podcast episode, and they themselves, the reporters themselves within the New York Times, found inaccuracies and contradictions that they couldn't verify, and they had to cancel the episode because they're like, actually, like, this is not proper journalism. So that's even a bigger scandal. But the New York Times, to this day, stands by the story, despite these questions, despite the internal claims as well from the audio producers. They stand by it, refuse to correct, and want to move on. A different story, Wall Street Journal. In January of 2024, they published an article alleging that an UNRWA staff had ties to Hamas. This particular story played a role in legitimizing the collapse of UNRWA's role in distributing aid in Gaza. A lot of the narratives and tropes and campaigns in the US to defund the UNRWA, to stop it. And it paved the way for the creation of the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, which is basically shoot for sport, shooting kids and mothers and families who are coming to get aid, putting them in cages like cattle. It's insane. 6 months after that report, the Wall Street Journal admitted it couldn't verify the allegations that it reported. And they didn't apologize. They just said, we couldn't verify it. We're not retracting it. It's there. And I guess the last one, which everybody knows about, first month of the genocide, Sarah Seidner on the CNN came out and said that Hamas beheaded 40 babies. The next day, she had to say, actually, it's an unverified claim. I'm sorry I said it. I should be careful with my words. But I was watching CNN that day. A different reporter repeated it. Nobody cared. Nobody cared that there was a retraction or an apology in that moment. The damage is done. We need to be careful with the news, and we're not.
Yeah, I mean, to state the obvious, with all of the examples of that you just gave, they all fed into Israeli policy, Israeli government policy. It's exactly what they wanted each time. Just stating the obvious to connect the dots. But I guess in that instance, are there no because you said they didn't apologize or anything? Are there no consequences? Nothing that anybody can do to take legal action, maybe something like that?
That's the thing. I think I've heard of, I don't know if this is true, but I've heard that some people are maybe looking into some form of legal action, but it's really difficult in the US because you have all these laws that protect the free press, right? So like, how can you actually navigate, how can you prosecute and hold media organizations accountable for manufacturing consent? They can tell you, oh, that was the news of the day, and they can move on. So I think that needs to be looked at more intently. I think, we do need more solid international laws when it comes to media complicity. And it's not the first time. This is not the first time. I mean, look at how the media manufactured consent for the invasion of Iraq. Years later, it came out that they actually fabricated sources. They called them anonymous sources, but it was just fabrications to encourage and support the Bush administration into going into Iraq. I think that there's more power with the news consumer and the journalists in the newsroom. We can strike. We can keep pushing. We can band together. We can unsubscribe as news consumers. We can send letters. We can do what Camera is doing. If we see an episode on public radio that featured a Palestinian guest who really said, really talked about their experience in Gaza, we need to send a letter and say, thank you for featuring that voice. I'm glad that I was hearing it. I hope to hear more. When you read an article that has a lie, like when they lied about Shireen Abu Akleh in 2000, when the Israeli sniper killed her. The very first line in the New York Times was a lie. People went on social media, they sent emails, they said, you've published a lie. And even though that lie stayed online for 11 hours, they eventually corrected it. There is some power in collective action, and we're not taking it seriously, I think. I think it feels more tangible to protest, which we should protest. It feels more tangible to maybe call your member of parliament or your member of Congress. These things might feel more tangible because maybe you're engaging with somebody. But when you think about the media, it's already out. What is there to do? I think we should do something about it. I think we should organize ourselves. Associations that already exist for journalists need to organize themselves around the protection of these journalists, so it becomes safe for us to say, hey, this is inaccurate. I'm pushing for fair reporting. If I want to use the word apartheid because the source said it, I don't have to debate you on why I should or shouldn't use it, which was a lot of these little debates that were happening. When I spoke to journalists, that they're literally quoting somebody and they're being told, remove that word in that quote. We don't want to say genocide. We don't want to say ethnic cleansing. You can't do that. That's journalistic malpractice. And then when you look at them, quoting basically Jewish supremacists or Zionists, it's okay. What they say that's hateful is okay to be out there.
Yeah, I mean, it was going to be one of my final questions now, really, like what we can do all about this, because everything you've said so far suggests that really media here in the West, and I guess specifically in the US where you've done this investigation, is compromised by Israeli influence. Where would you scale that level of compromise if possible?
Listen, I would like to say that the influence of Israel, the Israel lobby, has been compromised in the West, in the US. I don't think so. I think that public opinion is definitely shifting. I think people are changing their minds. I think even within right-wing spaces in the US, you're seeing a different rhetoric. So maybe from that perspective, the narrative is shifting. Israel is perhaps losing some of the battles in the narrative war that we're having with them. But I think that in order for influence to be compromised, sanctions have to be imposed on Israel. There needs to be real action from Congress, stopping aid, military aid to the Israeli regime. These things have not happened. So from one hand, maybe public opinion is changing, and that's fantastic. And it's not just because of the work of journalists, it's also because of the work of activists and community members on the ground. We're winning the narrative battle, but Palestinians are still being killed by Israeli bombs. Aid is still being held at the border. Annexation of land in Gaza and the West Bank continues. Demolition of homes, expulsion of Palestinians. Those things have not changed. The material reality of Palestinians under occupation has not changed. So I'm not somebody who's comfortable saying that Israeli influence is compromised when the number of martyrs continues to rise. I think until we actually see action for the narrative wins that we're having, we can say that their influence is compromised.
Well, I think that's a great note to end on. Thank you so much for your time, Laura.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.